Capital appears in 1867, at the very moment Europe feels most certain of itself. Welcome to another scene from the book The History of Economics in 25 Scenes. Today I'll tell you about Marx and the birth of the critical economy. Steam engines cut across continents, steel feeds empires, markets rise like cathedrals, promising endless progress. To many, modernity looks triumphant, almost complete. But Karl Marx looks past the glittering surface and into the engine underneath. He sees a system that grows through contradiction. Wealth expands, yet poverty deepens. Innovation accelerates, yet crises grow more violent. What others celebrate as success, Marx recognizes as sickness. His question is simple and dangerous. For whom does the market actually work? Classical economists chart the movement of goods. Marx looks instead at production itself. Behind every exchange, he finds an imbalance of power. Owners and workers, command and obedience. What appears neutral on the surface hides a structure of domination beneath. The market does not erase hierarchy, it reorganizes it. By turning the assumptions of Smith and Ricardo upside down, Marx transforms economics. The economy is no longer a system of harmony, but a battlefield dressed as order. Its laws are not eternal. They are historical, shaped by struggle, scarcity and force. Capital is not a guide to reform. It is a moral X-ray of civilization, and what it reveals is unsettling. Humanity has become both the builder of the system and the material it consumes. Marx begins by flipping economics upside down. What Adam Smith described as a dance of mutual benefit, Marx sees as a choreography of domination. The market, in his view, is not a neutral space where free individuals exchange value. It is a battlefield disguised as order, elegant on the surface, coercive underneath. The so-called laws of supply and demand are not laws of nature at all. They are social rules written in the language of necessity. Behind every price, behind every contract, Marx finds a power relation. Those who own the means of production set the terms. Those who own nothing but their labor must accept them. This is where freedom turns into a paradox. The worker is free to sell his labor, and equally free to starve if he does not. Choice exists in form, but not in substance. The harmony praised by classical economics is, for Marx, a moral inversion. Dependence is renamed freedom. Inequality becomes merit. Exploitation is recast as efficiency. The system's greatest achievement is not productivity, but persuasion. It convinces people that coercion is voluntary, that necessity is choice. By exposing this contradiction, Marx changes the purpose of economics itself. It is no longer a science of wealth. It becomes a critique of power. To understand value is to understand hierarchy. To study the market is to expose the civilization that produced it. Economics, stripped of its claim to neutrality, reveals itself as history, written not in the language of virtue, but in the language of profit. Marx takes the labor theory of value from Ricardo and turns it into an accusation. If labor creates value, he asks, then why does the worker remain poor while the capitalist grows rich? The answer lies, for Marx, in a quiet deception built into everyday exchange. The worker does not sell the product of his labor. He sells his capacity to work, his labor power. Its price, the wage, is set not by what his work actually creates, but by what he needs to survive. Food, shelter, bare continuation. Everything beyond that belongs to someone else. The gap between what labor produces and what labor is paid is what Marx calls surplus value. And that surplus does not disappear. It is captured as profit by the owner of capital. This, for Marx, is not a malfunction of capitalism. It is its core. The system depends on the constant extraction of surplus from those who create it. Exploitation does not need cruelty or malice. It requires only contracts, laws, and habits that present inequality as efficiency and necessity as fairness. That is why profit looks innocent. It appears as reward for risk, discipline, or intelligence. But in Marx's vision, profit is something more troubling, a refined form of appropriation made respectable by custom and theory. Capitalism succeeds not because it hides injustice badly, but because it hides it perfectly. Coercion becomes consent, necessity becomes virtue, and freedom itself is transformed into the currency of exploitation. One of Marx's most unsettling ideas is the fetishism of commodities. It begins with a simple illusion. In capitalist society, objects appear to have a life of their own. A coat, a loaf of bread, a machine. They seem valuable simply because they exist and can be exchanged. Their value looks natural, almost magical. Money becomes the supreme fetish, an abstraction admired and pursued for its own sake. What disappears is labor. The human effort that created these things fades from view. What was once the product of work turns into a power that governs life. Objects begin to rule their makers. In this inversion, relations between people are replaced by relations between things. The worker faces a world that feels alien, his own creation standing above him like an independent force. The more he produces, the less he belongs to what he produces. The more society connects through exchange, the more isolated individuals feel within it. For Marx, this is not a technical detail. It is the psychological core of capitalism. Human creativity is transformed into something external, impersonal, and authoritative. Power no longer appears as domination by people, but as obedience to prices, markets, and trends. Commodity fetishism is the veil through which the modern world misrecognizes itself. It explains why brands inspire loyalty, prices command respect, and markets provoke awe, as if these were forces of nature rather than social arrangements. Marx, writing among factories and ledgers, was already describing our world. A civilization where value is no longer what things are, but what they appear to be. Marx never treats capitalism as an error. He sees it as a necessary and even brilliant stage in human development. It is at the same time the engine of progress and the architect of its own collapse. No earlier system unleashes such energy, innovation, and connection. And yet, every triumph carries the seed of failure. The same forces that create abundance also generate instability. The competition that drives invention slowly concentrates power into fewer hands. At the center of this tension stands what Marx calls the law of accumulation. Capital grows by reinvesting itself, expanding production beyond what society can actually absorb. So the system moves in cycles. Boom gives way to crisis. Factories overproduce. Markets saturate. Profits fall. Destruction follows, until the ground is cleared for the next expansion. These crises are not accidents. They are the pulse of capitalism itself. As capital concentrates, inequality deepens. A small minority owns the means of production. The majority owns only its labor. This polarization, Marx believes, will eventually awaken the working class to its collective power. Revolution is not a moral appeal or an act of revenge. It is the logical outcome of the system's own dynamics. For Marx, capitalism captures the paradox of human genius. It frees creativity while enslaving its creators. It builds the modern world, but cannot give that world a soul. Its brilliance lies in turning everything into value. Its tragedy lies in forgetting what value is for. Marx's real power lies in one decisive move. He exposes economics as politics by another name. He removes the mask of neutrality from the marketplace and shows that what classical economists call natural law is in fact a human arrangement, a structure of power dressed up as logic. profit stops being a technical outcome and becomes an ethical question. In that sense, Marx does not merely analyze capitalism. He makes it morally visible. But inside this brilliance sits a tension. By reducing human beings to class positions, Marx flattens the very complexity that allows societies to change. He sees structure more clearly than spontaneity, necessity more than imagination. Individuals appear as products of history, rarely as its authors. What he treats as inevitability is, in reality, adaptability. Capitalism's ability to reform itself, absorb critique, and evolve without collapsing. This is Marx's paradox. The more precisely he understands the system's logic, the less he believes it can bend. He captures its anatomy, but not its metabolism. The 20th century will prove him both right and wrong. Right about the persistence of inequality, wrong about its final resolution. What endures is not his prophecy, but his moral nerve. Marx teaches that economics is never innocent. Every distribution of wealth is also a distribution of dignity. His critique survives not as a blueprint for the future, but as a conscience for the present. Marx changes economics forever by turning it from the language of balance into the grammar of conflict. He pulls the discipline away from equations and comforting moral stories and forces it to face what it had hidden: power. After Marx, wealth can no longer be treated as a neutral pile of goods. It must be seen as a relationship between those who command and those who obey. The market stops being a machine and becomes a mirror, reflecting hierarchy rather than harmony. History shows that many of his answers were wrong. Revolutions carried his name and consumed their own ideals. And yet, his questions refuse to disappear. Is the market just? Can freedom exist without equality? What is value, if not human effort disguised as numbers? These questions still echo in lecture halls, parliaments, and policy debates across the world. For some, Marx remains a prophet of emancipation. For others, a warning about utopias that turn into tyranny. But for history, he is something harder to dismiss: a permanent interlocutor, a voice that survives both failure and success. Marx forces economics to remain morally awake, even when it tries to forget him. His legacy is not a plan for the future, but a challenge for every age. Measure prosperity not by the abundance of things, but by the dignity of those who make them. Every generation thinks it can finally leave Marx behind. And every generation ends up arguing with him again. Not because his answers were final, they were not, but because his questions cut too deep to ignore. He reminds us that economies are never just about growth, prices, or efficiency. They are always about people, about power, about dignity, about who carries the cost of progress and who collects its rewards. Here is the thought that closes this scene. An economy that refuses to face its moral shadow will eventually be ruled by it. And one last provocation before we move on. If value comes from human labor, why do humans so often feel worthless inside the systems they sustain? Join me in the next scene, where economics turns from critique to reaction, and the 20th century begins its long struggle to escape Marx without ever fully succeeding.